Let's start with this. I usually don't like to start with hard news stories, but of course we did read the other day from the Houston Chronicle about really just some barbaric practices being
Yeah.
employed down at the border by DPS. I wonder, is there a point where will we ask, have Governor Abbott's actions on the border and his policies reached a point where they kind of gone beyond the normal political back and forth and are reaching something that's, perhaps immoral?
Yeah, I think Greg Abbott's border stunts have now become atrocities. As you mentioned, the Houston Chronicle is reporting on released internal emails that show officers being ordered to push women and children back into the Rio Grande. They're reporting on razor traps that are designed to maim and drown human beings. And that should trouble all of us, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. Greg Abbott is hunting people for his own political gain. And that's the most cynical thing that I've seen in my time in Texas politics.
And should the federal government be intervening to stop the Texas governor from implementing these policies?
Absolutely. I hope Joe Biden will do the right thing and act on behalf of everyone in this state and around the country who's horrified at what they're seeing on our southern border. So I think Joe Biden, his administration, and federal lawmakers have a moral responsibility to step in and prevent these human rights abuses that are happening in our name.
Let's take a step back a little and look at the legislative session. I know the recent special session just wrapped up. I wonder, the 2021 session was considered, something of a fractured session, an arch conservative session. I wonder this one, the 88th legislature, were the results of it something that Texans can be proud of?
No, is the short answer. I think there were, of course, silver linings. There were bright spots. I was proud to pass legislation to reduce prescription drug costs and childcare costs, and help prevent teen overdose deaths. But on the whole, you really saw a missed opportunity to help Texans and to solve the big problems that we face in this state. We came into the session with a $33 billion budget surplus. That's billion with a B. That's bigger than a lot of states' entire budgets. And we failed to use that unprecedented surplus to give Texas teachers a pay raise, to increase funding for our public schools around the state, to lower the number of uninsured people. We have the most uninsured people of any state in the country. And we refuse to use that surplus to fight climate change. And we're seeing the ramifications of our failure to fight climate change this summer. This, I think, is the hottest day on record in Austin's history. So on that front, it was a missed opportunity to really do good for our constituents and for the people across the state. And we saw precious legislative time eaten up with culture war fights and partisan gridlock. You saw Christian nationalist bills that moved through the process, like book banning and discriminatory legislation against LGBTQ people. So, on the whole, I would say that this session was a failure in that regard. But there were good people in our office and in other offices doing good work every day, even under difficult circumstances.
And to close the session, I know the Senate and House came to an agreement on the property tax deal. It looks like most of you and most of your Democratic colleagues were able to get behind that bill. Why were y'all able to support those bills en masse?
Well, in the minority, we're oftentimes put in the difficult position of, having to support something that's good, but could be great. We know that property taxes are a tremendous problem in our state. And I've got constituents of mine who are being priced out of the homes that they've lived in for 20, 30 years. And so property tax relief for homeowners is critical, and which is why I supported the legislation. But my colleagues and I also provided amendments that were rejected by the Republican majority that would have helped renters. About 40% of our state rents their property. They don't own, they rent, whether it's an apartment or a house. And those renters are not going to see any relief from this bill. We also tried to provide amendments that would have increased public education funding in addition to these property tax cuts. And that was rejected by our Republican majority. So yes, property tax relief for homeowners is critically important. I support it, so I voted for the bill, but I just wish they had taken some Democratic amendments to provide even more relief, not just to homeowners, but to renters and to our public educators and public school students.
And I know most of what we've discussed so far is, somewhat negative, but I want to turn it around and maybe speak to some of your highlights from the legislative session. I know you filed just dozens upon dozens of bills, from everything from tree planting to school safety to election reform. I wonder, when you were filing these bills, what was your vision, or what was your big idea for the session?
Yeah, we have an entire agenda that covers everything from high quality public education to affordable healthcare to a clean environment. And so we introduced legislation on all of those topics, some of them more ambitious than others. I introduced a bill to give every Texas teacher a $15,000 pay raise. I know that was an uphill battle, but I at least wanted to communicate to my colleagues and to our state leaders what kind of pay raise is necessary to keep teachers in the profession, and also to attract the best and brightest into the teaching profession. I also proposed a constitutional amendment that would have given every Texan a right to clean air and clean water and a clean environment. That, of course, is also an uphill battle in this state, but I wanted to put that forward because climate change is an existential emergency that we're all facing. And so some bills like that didn't pass, but they at least started a conversation that's needed at the state capitol. But then I also introduced bills that did become law. I mentioned earlier that we passed a bill to reduce prescription drug costs, and we did that by passing a bill to allow Texas to import cheap prescription drugs from Canada. Texas paid twice as much as any other industrialized country for our prescription drugs. And that means that a lot of Texans have to ration or skip doses, which can be deadly. And so our legislation will reduce costs by about 60 to 70% on commonly used prescription drugs like EpiPens or blood pressure medication or cancer drugs. So I was proud to have Republican support on that legislation and was proud to pass it into law. There was another bill that we introduced that would provide property tax relief and exemptions to child care centers. Right now, child care is more expensive than college in our state, and it's the most important thing we could spend our money on. 85% of brain development occurs before the age of 3, and most families can no longer afford to access high quality early childhood education. So we were able to pass that bill into law and infuse our child care centers around the state with much needed financial resources that will reduce costs for working families around Texas. The last one I'll mention that did become law was a bill to fight teen overdose deaths. So we're facing a crisis with fentanyl overdoses in our state. And a few years ago, a 13-year-old boy died in a Texas middle school by overdosing on fentanyl. And that school district, in response to his death, decided to put Narcan, the medication that can reverse an opioid overdose, on every campus in their district. And they've already saved the lives of 5 kids with that policy. And so I passed a bill to take that statewide. So now every school campus across the state is going to have Narcan on their campuses to prevent and reverse any fentanyl overdoses that happen on school grounds.
You described about 6 or 7 policies right there that all sound like reasonable, grounded policies. And besides the teacher pay raise, I don't think I heard about a single one of them, but I did hear about, all of these bills, limiting the rights of transgender individuals and the culture wars, if you will. So how do we shift the paradigm to where, we're talking more about policy and not about, exclusion and limiting the rights of others?
It's a great question. And to answer it, I'm going to talk about a bill that I introduced that didn't pass. I am representing House District 50 this term. It's a new district for me. I used to represent House District 52, but that district was destroyed in the redistricting process. My Republican colleagues gerrymandered that district in order to try to get rid of me. Thankfully, I was able to move back home to the district where I grew up here in District 50 and run for reelection. But because of that experience, the first bill that I filed in this new session was a bill to reform our redistricting process and take the power from politicians and give it to an independent, citizens-led redistricting commission, which is what a lot of other states are moving toward. And the reason that's so important is because our redistricting system, our gerrymandered districts, are at the core of our broken political system. You know, if you have only solidly red districts that are 80% Trump districts and solidly blue districts that are 80% Biden districts, that means elected officials like me only have to win our primary to get reelected. And that means that you are really only listening to the folks who vote in primaries. And those folks tend to be more extreme in their policy positions than folks who don't vote in primaries. And if you think about the Republican primary, there are only about 1 million Texans who vote in that Republican primary statewide. And that group of people are essentially making decisions for the other 29 million Texans because of the way our gerrymandering works and the way our primary system works. And so that, to me, is what's led us in this direction of more extreme policymaking, culture war fights, political grandstanding, rather than appealing to the broad middle of the electorate who want to see progress on things like healthcare and education. So that, I think, is something we got to pay more attention to. Oftentimes we get in these discussions about policy topics and we forget to talk about political reform. And I think political reform, although it's not very sexy, is probably the most important thing that we could spend our time talking about.
Recently, Representative John Bryant of Dallas told Texas Monthly that Democrats in the legislature have, basically stopped fighting because they're accepting the scraps that the Republicans are willing to offer. Was that an accurate assessment?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. But in other instances, I've seen my colleagues fight fiercely for our democratic values. I fought tooth and nail against Greg Abbott's voucher scam, against the bill to mandate the 10 Commandments be posted in every classroom, the bill that would have replaced school counselors with untrained, unqualified religious chaplains. So, my colleagues and I fight every single day, but sometimes we're faced with the difficult decision of, trying to weaken a dangerous bill, right? And oftentimes on the outside, people think in terms of black and white, when in reality, when you're in this difficult situation, you're oftentimes trying to choose between different shades of gray. And if there's a dangerous bill that's going to hurt people, we do have a moral obligation as Democrats, even in the minority, to accept some compromises that can reduce the harm of that particular bill, because it could mean, thousands of lives are saved. And so these moral decisions are not as easy, I think, as some folks try to make them out to be. And oftentimes, at least in my experience, these can be excruciating decisions. And you're oftentimes having to pick between terrible options. But Representative Bryant is a good friend of mine, and I respect the hell out of him. And I think he does have a point that Democrats in the state legislature have been in the minority for 2 decades, and many of them have gotten comfortable being in the minority. And so we've got to kind of rekindle that fighting spirit, and Representative Bryant is a big part of doing that for us.
And of course, one way to rekindle that fighting spirit would be for, Democrats to win some statewide elections. And I wonder, Democrats had a lot of momentum after 2018, the election that saw you come to office. And, some of that momentum perhaps has dwindled a little bit after the elections in 2020 and 2022. I wonder if Democrats aren't able to break through and start winning some elections, if they risk losing the base in Texas and watching the state become something more like what Florida is right now?
I think you're absolutely right that our focus has to be on winning elections. That's the ball game. We Democrats in the minority in the legislature can do as much as we can, but we at the end of the day we still don't have the numbers. And many of these fights on the floor of the House are not about policy. They're not about rules. They're about power, and it's who has the votes and who doesn't. And until we can start winning elections, not just top of the ticket, not just statewide, but legislative elections, local elections for county commissioners and school boards and city councils, then we're never going to be able to wield power in this democracy and be able to enact our policy agenda. So, every time we get caught in these discussions about what Democrats in the minority should do, I try to refocus us on the real prize, which is winning elections and winning real political power so that we can legislate on behalf of Texans.
And you may remember this or you may not, but the first time I interviewed you was actually at your house about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
In early 2018.
Seems
And
like a
at that,
lifetime ago.
yeah, like a lifetime ago. And at that time, I was a struggling podcaster. You were a 20-something first-time candidate putting your name out there. 5 years later, I'm still a struggling podcaster, but you're a rising star in the Texas Democratic Party. And I framed that question that way just so I can ask you the classic interview question. Politically, where do you see yourself 5 years from now?
Well, I hope that I win re-election to the Texas House. That's my first priority, and I'm running for re-election this cycle so that I can hopefully get back to the House and keep fighting for the things that we've spent this whole interview talking about. But I'm not going to be coy. I do want to have a statewide impact. I think I and my team have a lot to offer, both as a candidate and as an office holder. But I don't have any immediate plans to do that. It's everything at this point is just theoretical, but one day I would absolutely love to run statewide.
And with that, that's State Representative James Talarico. Representative Talarico, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Thanks for having me, Ned.